Good evening, everyone. I'm Austin Williams, Curriculum Coordinator for the Kansas Historical Society, and we are broadcasting to you live from the Kansas Museum of History. Thank you all so much for joining us for our monthly virtual museum after hours. We have a wonderful program lined up for you this evening, and for those of you who are perhaps joining us for the first time, tonight's presentation will be followed by a question and answer period with our speaker. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, or feel free to enter your questions into the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. Tonight, we are thrilled to be joined by CJ Janovy, a veteran journalist with deep roots in the Midwest. She is currently Director of Content at KCUR, Kansas City's NPR affiliate, where she has also served as a digital managing editor and an arts reporter. In 2020, she was the founding opinion editor at the Kansas Reflector. Janovy also spent more than a decade as editor of The Pitch, Kansas City's alternative weekly newspaper. She grew up in Nebraska, graduated from the University of California at Berkeley, and earned a master's in creative writing from Boston University. Tonight's presentation centers on her award-winning book, No Place Like Home: Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas. Far from the coastal centers of culture and politics, many Americans envision Kansas as a place where members of LGBTQ communities live. No Place Like Home, however, is a book about why these individuals choose to stay. The book tells the epic story of how a few disorganized and politically naive Kansans, realizing they were unfairly under attack, rolled up their sleeves, went looking for fights, and ended up making friends in one of the country's most hostile states, or, as CJ likes to call it, a love story. So please join me in welcoming CJ Janovy.
Thank you, Austin, so much for that that introduction and my love story piece of the description of the book. And hi, everyone. It's so great to be with you, even though I can't see you. But I'm so grateful for this introduction or this opportunity to share these stories with the folks who care about history in Kansas and Kansas itself. It's just an honor to be asked to share tonight. So thank you. And what I'm going to do is show a few pictures, talk about my book, and I'm going to read a few passages, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happened since the book came out. So I guess without any further explanation, I'll go ahead and share. I've told this story a few times around Kansas over the last 4 years since the book came out. And basically the story starts, this is a very, very specific history of Kansas. It takes place over about a decade, approximately 2005 to approximately 2010. And so it's a decade of Kansas history. It's a very specific part of LGBT history in Kansas, and so is by no means exhaustive or even anywhere close to the whole story. It's about this. It was inspired, I guess, by this event that happened in 2004 and 2005 in Kansas, but also all over the whole country, really. Many of you, I'm sure, will remember that in the mid-2000s, many of the states in the country passed constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriage, saying that marriage was only between one man and one woman. And this happened in Kansas. It took 2 sessions of the legislature for this amendment to actually get placed on the ballot for a statewide vote. Lawmakers and supporters of the marriage amendment tried to get it on a ballot in 2004, and they were not successful. They did get it on the ballot in April 2005, at which point 70% of the voters of Kansas voted to ban same-sex marriage. And this is the LGBT folks who had desperately tried to stop this. This is folks looking at the results on the night that happened, and you can see that they're not very happy about this vote in Kansas. So what happens about 10 years later, almost exactly, the United States Supreme Court legalizes same-sex marriage all throughout the United States. And by that point, we've seen a pretty dramatic change in public opinion. Nearly 55% of the people, nearly 55% of Americans are fine with same-sex marriage. And so how do we get from, 70% of voters, that was pretty much the margin of the vote throughout the country in those years, 70% of voters saying, being against same-sex marriage to 55% being for same-sex marriage. It was a multi directional campaign over those years. It was obviously a legal strategy that took place over a decade, but also there were just a lot of people who were surprised. Activists were not anticipating that LGBT activists nationally were not anticipating that same-sex marriage was going to become an issue in the mid-2000s. And when it became an issue, a lot of us got more organized than ever before, and we had to educate communities and friends, loved ones, coworkers, et cetera. And so what my book does talks about the effort in Kansas that began with this marriage amendment and then educated a bunch of people, and as Austin said, won us a bunch of friends. So how do I do this? I drove all around the state of Kansas, starting in around 2013, 2014. All the dots on this map are places that I visited, and or where people lived who I interviewed in the course of researching my book. And book really begins with that, with the marriage amendment vote in 2005. And so it's organized sort of chronologically. So I visit those places, but I also begin to talk about what happens after the marriage amendment passes. And what happens after it passes is, those people that we saw earlier looking at those very unhappy election results, they realized that they were in no shape whatsoever to fight a statewide effort against LGBT people. And so what they did was they got organized. And you saw a statewide organization called Equality Kansas, startup chapters all throughout the state in places like Hutchinson, Salina, Topeka, Lawrence, Southwest Kansas, and specifically in place in Hutchinson, Manhattan, and Salina. These groups went to, in Manhattan, there was another organization called the Flint Hills Human Rights Project. And so these folks went to City Hall. They said, please, you have, every city has a non-discrimination ordinances, and it says you can't be discriminated against on the basis of race or religion or marital status. There's several categories. And folks went to City Hall and they said, please add sexual orientation and gender identity to the non-discrimination ordinances at City Hall. And this became very contentious in these three cities, Manhattan, Salina, and Hutchinson. And so this was really when I began to notice, this is just a story that ran in the Kansas City Star in 2012, where one of the Kansas City Star reporters went out to write about what was going on, in this case, was in Hutchinson. And in all of these cities, it was a little bit different what happened in each city, but basically, there would be weeks or months of testimony at City Hall. There would be town hall meetings. There would be letters to the editor. There would be articles in the newspaper, and this would become a citywide debate. And in each case, again, it was a little bit different, but either the city commission would pass it, and then there would be a petition effort to get it repealed, or which is what happened in Hutchinson and Salina. And in Manhattan, a new group of commissioners got elected and then repealed it. So in all these cases, it was a months-long process that the community went through. And the folks who went to City Hall and said, can you please add these ordinances, add these categories to the ordinance, non-discrimination ordinance at City Hall, they knew that there was a chance that they would lose. They knew that there was a chance that this would ultimately fail, but they also saw an opportunity to raise the issue, to have the conversation, and they knew that there was not only was it worth the effort to try, they knew that it would educate so many friends, neighbors, coworkers, family members. And so in all of these cities, what happened was, even though they didn't get their ordinance on the books protecting them, what they did get was education, was communities sort of coming out of the woodwork. They met new friends, they found new supporters. And in Salina, for example, in that chapter ends with Salina having the first ever gay pride event. And, they expect maybe 200 people to show up, but 500 people show up. And so you have people saying, our ordinance didn't pass, but it's the best time to be gay in Salina. Awaken Kansas, which is the website here that I'm showing, is an organization that was the opponent in all of these places. There was Awaken Salina, Awaken Manhattan, Awaken Hutchinson, and they really fought these efforts on religious grounds. You see that happening over and over when these ordinances are proposed. Tiffany Muller is one of the folks who was involved in the effort in Topeka originally in 2005. She was one of the early lobbyists who tried to stop the marriage amendment from going on the ballot in the first place. And I'm going to read you a little bit about Tiffany here in a second, but because the story with Tiffany is that she was her fellow activists called her sort of a force of nature, and she turned out to be a very skilled lobbyist at the state capitol, trying to keep this initiative off the ballot in 2005. And then folks noticed her skill, and there was a resignation on the Topeka City Council, and someone appointed her to serve. And so she became the first gay person on the Topeka City Council. And then she decided, the term came up, and she decided that she would actually run for the office to which she had been appointed. And it turns out that her district was also the same district that the Westboro Baptist Church was located in. And it also turned out that her name was on the ballot for city council on the same day as the statewide vote on the marriage amendment. And this earned national attention. And so I'm going to read you this is a first passage I'm going to read you. This is about Tiffany Muller. And this takes place early in the book. The chapter on Topeka is one of the early chapters. And so I'm going to start here from quoting from the New York Times. So Tiffany Muller decides to run for city council. The gay marriage amendment is on the statewide ballot. And as it turns out, one of the opponents that Tiffany Muller ends up running for city council is one of Fred Phelps's granddaughters. She decides to run for the city council as well. So the New York Times comes in and does a story on this, and I'll just pick up with the New York Times writing about this race. The race, according to the New York Times, has become as much as anything a debate over Mr. Phelps, whose incessant daily pickets and hate-filled faxes have plagued Topeka for 14 years, yet whose opposition to the anti-discrimination ordinance is shared by many residents of this church-laden, Republican-leaning city of 125,000. So I forgot to mention that Topeka is also trying to pass one of these non-discrimination ordinances at the same time. So here's the New York Times again. The Phelps's tactics have turned some evangelical ministers and conservative businessmen into unlikely crusaders for gay rights, backing measures like the anti-discrimination ordinance, if only as an antidote to the Phelps family's message. And with a constitutional amendment on the ballot to ban same-sex marriage in April, many other religious and civic leaders are trying mightily to stop the Phelpses from hijacking what they see as a signature issue. So as Tiffany Muller says, this is a powder keg in Topeka. Her father, who's on the city council in his small town in Cleveland, Missouri, brought her stepmother and joined. This is me writing now, so this is not the New York Times. Tiffany Muller's father brought her stepmother and joined Muller for a day of door-to-door campaigning. Because father and daughter had city council service in common, Muller said he thought it would be so neat. But he was canvassing in a town where citizens had spent decades steeping in the Phelps's toxins. People would yell at him and scream at him, "She's going to hell. How could you raise her to be like that? Get the hell off my porch. You're going to hell." Other times people would say, "Come in, you're our hero. I baked you lemon bars." This next passage has a four-letter word in it, just a warning for everyone. One night, a neighbor who had asked Muller for a yard sign several weeks earlier showed up at her house. She had a bloody lip and her face was messed up. You could tell she was going to have a black eye. I was like, "Oh my God, come in, what happened?" The woman told Muller she had left her house to go to the store, and some people nearby said, "Why do you have that fucking dyke's sign in your yard? Are you a dyke?" The woman said, "Yeah, so what?" Muller had no idea her neighbor was gay. They followed her to the store and they beat her up in the parking lot. Horrified, Muller was preparing to call the police and take her neighbor to the hospital, but that wasn't why the woman had knocked on her door. She says, No, don't call the police. They stole my yard sign and I want another yard sign." So that's the atmosphere around Topeka in around 2005. But as I said earlier, the book sort of takes off from there, and it talks about these efforts to organize in these cities and how people began to come out and make friends. And there was a chapter of Equality Kansas that formed out in Southwest Kansas. So it was a Southwest Kansas chapter of Equality. It was started up in Dodge City, and it had members in Garden City. And one of the people who led that effort was a woman named Tanya Jantz, and she lived in Cimarron. And so there's this chapter that I have about midway through the book about what's going on out in Southwest Kansas. And Tanya is one of the folks who's one of the people that I write about out there. And so I'll just read you a little bit about Tanya's story. She had known since she was different from age 7 or 8, but in the 70s in Western Kansas, there were no words to describe it. Jance dated men after heading to Southwestern College, a tiny Methodist school in Winfield, south of Wichita, on a tennis scholarship. But she kept discovering that more of the girls on her teams were lesbians. Her dorm was filled with them. They invited her to their parties, which made her uncomfortable until she finally came out herself, fake IDing her way into fantasy in Wichita in the mid-'80s. It was so awesome, she said of the bar. You had the country music side and the rock side and the outside part with the volleyball nets. And it was just 200 gay people every Friday and Saturday night. All the basketball players from Bethany and Bethel and Southwestern, these are the evangelical, Lutheran, Mennonite, and Methodist affiliated colleges in Lindsborg, Newton, and Winfield that competed against each other on Saturday nights. But on Friday nights, we'd be out there and hook up and talk and communicate in our secret language, secret world. Jance moved to Kansas City for chiropractic school, and as her graduation drew near in the early 90s, she planned on establishing a practice in Denver. I thought, I need to go someplace and be gay, really, and not have to hide myself. But the chiropractor in Cimarron, Dr. Ellis, was ill with emphysema and cancer. Jance had to do an internship anyway, so she figured she'd spend a few weeks studying with him and visiting her family. People begged her to stay. This is not someplace I want to live at all, Jance thought. Unlike Denver, Cimarron was home to only about 2,000 people. She liked mountains, but Cimarron was high plains flat. She liked to ride jet skis, but Cimarron was an hour and a half from the nearest decent lake. She didn't like the heat, didn't like the constant wind, or the omnipresent stench of feed yards. People would say, "That's the smell of money, Tanya." Well, it's not my money. It's like, geez, it stinks out here. But the people were irresistible. People in Southwest Kansas, they're just very endearing, very loving, very giving. Sometimes for Jance, the smell of money was fresh bread or a casserole. A Mennonite lady might come in with 6 kids and say, "I need them worked on, I can't afford it." Okay, sure, I'll take cookies and whatever you got. So I did a whole lot of free care. I still do a lot of free care. When Jance says still, she's talking about more than 20 years. Jance buckled down, healing the aches and pains of Cimarron and spending time with her grandparents. Fearing she would lose her family if they found out she was gay, she hid that part of herself, or she thought she did. One day she went to pick up her 76-year-old grandfather who was being released from the hospital in Dodge. Listening to music on the drive home, he asked if she had any Melissa Etheridge. I was like, really? He goes, yeah, your Aunt Linda listens to that "Come to My Window" song all the time. Do you have that? Of course, Jance did. So I popped in the CD and we're listening to it. And he goes, "You know, she's from Leavenworth, right? She's from Kansas." I said, "Well, yes, Grandpa, I do." He says, "Do you know she's a lesbian?" I about choked and wrecked the truck. I said, "Yes, I do." And he goes, "Well, you know, that's just all right." And that was all that was all that was said. It was all that needed to be said. Jance stayed with him every night for the next month, helping her grandmother take care of him until he died at home. So that's about halfway through the book. Now we get to about, 3/4 of the way through the book. And by now, what's happening is the same-sex marriage lawsuits are winding their way up to the Supreme Court. And people might not remember this, but in 2013, there was a ruling by the United States Supreme Court that legalized same-sex marriage in some states around the country. And this kicked off really a couple years of legal battles, and states, including Kansas, were trying very desperately to keep same-sex marriage from becoming illegal here. But the different federal courts around the country kept allowing same-sex marriage, and finally the district that includes Kansas allowed it, and the governor at the time, Sam Brownback, fought it desperately, and there was a lot of legal back and forth about this. But by the fall of 2014, In some counties, there were people in Kansas who were going ahead and getting married. So this is one of those couples, Darcy Potroff and Jolene Spain in Manhattan. And, you know, Sam Brownback and his administration is, as I said, desperately trying to fight same-sex marriage from becoming law in Kansas. But here I'll start reading. Far away from Brownback's cold-hearted office, the people of Kansas were starting to show that he didn't represent all of them. In Manhattan, something unusual began happening after Darcy Potroff and Jolene Spain's ceremony on the sidewalk outside the Riley County Courthouse in November put them at the center of a small market media frenzy involving the Manhattan Mercury, the KSNT TV broadcast from Topeka, and some AM radio news stations. The two women hadn't been particularly aggressive activists. We don't have rainbow flags hanging all over everything. I'm not out there going, gay rights for everybody, Potroff said. The biggest thing we do, most importantly, we're at home. We do some really strange things like have picnics in the backyard. We mow our lawn, we keep a nice house, we trim the shrubbery out front, we maintain our vehicles, maintain our home. We have kids and now 5 grandsons. We make a statement by being normal. Getting married in front of the media was the most newsworthy thing either one of them had ever done, although Potroff had managed to get appointed to a seat on the city council of Riley, population just under 1,000. One day in the grocery store, a woman approached them. I do not know this lady, Spain remembered. She saw us, she looked, she went a little bit away, looked again, turned around, and came back. She put her hand on my arm and said, "Are you the couple that got married?" I said, "Yeah, we are." She said, "Can I give you a hug?" She started bawling, just sobbing on Darcy's shoulder. She was like, "I'm so happy for you." Wedding cards and presents came pouring in, which wasn't surprising because the couple had a wide circle of friends. But then envelopes started arriving in their mailbox with no return address. Wedding cards signed simply Dave and Martha, or other names they didn't know, no last names. Quiet but solid, classically Kansan gestures of support. Okay, I'm going to read just one more passage now. This is the last couple of chapters of the book deal with the emergence of transgender leaders in Kansas. One of those folks was Stephanie Mott from Topeka, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago and left a big absence in the LGBTQ movement in Kansas. But before Stephanie really became a leader in Kansas way before most people were thinking about what it meant to be transgender. And she began getting involved in the statewide LGBTQ movement around the late 2010s, around 2011. And she would go tell her story to anyone who asked. So she gave hundreds and hundreds of presentations around the state to church groups, parents and friends of gays and lesbians, diversity events, any kind of she would visit classrooms, anyone that would have a presentation, maybe even like the Kansas Historical Society, she would go and tell her story. And it was a really compelling story of growing up in Lawrence, always knowing that she was not the boy that she was raised to be, and becoming really so distressed about this that she fell into homelessness and addiction. But then while she was staying in a men's shelter in Topeka, she went to church and sort of very literally was born again and began living authentically as Stephanie. And in the course of her efforts to educate people, the 4th of July weekend in 2011, Stephanie drove a huge circle around the state of Kansas and stopped people in public places like restaurant parking lots, in small towns all around the state. You could see the car that she drove had these bumper stickers saying that she was transgender and Christian. And she would just stop people randomly and ask them what they knew about transgender. And a lot of people, she later said, they would say they didn't know anything about it. They didn't know anyone who was trans. And she said, actually, now you do, because you just met me. And from this, what she called the Transgender Tour of Kansas, she realized that, people generally had two reactions. One of them was, trans, is that like gay? It's not really like gay. The other response generally she found was that, was sort of a live and let live. That's kind of how people felt about it. And so she realized that, especially from that question, is that like gay? She realized that people just needed educating. So she started the Kansas statewide transgender education project and really, like I said, began telling her story all over and educating as many folks as she possibly could. I will I'll start. So I'll read this passage from the end of the profile of Stephanie that I wrote. It gets to be the summer of 25. And Stephanie decides that she needs to go on another transgender tour, only this is going to be a faith tour. So she's going to visit churches around the region, not just in Kansas. And this is, this is just shortly after Caitlyn Jenner was on the cover of Vanity Fair. That was in the spring of 2015. Again, Stephanie Mott had been active in Kansas for years by that point. But I'll just start reading. While Jenner was securing the surreal world of television, Stephanie Mott was plowing much more difficult terrain, churches in the Bible Belt. She called this expedition the Transgender Faith Tour. It might have been stopping at friendly, liberal, mostly Unitarian Universalist churches, but they were in places like Tulsa, Little Rock, Columbus, Ohio, and Springfield, Missouri. And her home state. On July 12th, Mott visited the adult Sunday school class at Peace United Church of Christ in the tiny Flint Hills town of Alma, about 30 miles south of Manhattan. She had been there before, she wrote on Facebook. It must have been the early 1980s when my brother Dan was the pastor there. Dan and I both struggled with alcohol and demons unknown to ourselves and each other. He lost his battle, indirectly related to alcohol, in 2000, and he never got to meet his sister Stephanie. 20 years earlier, Mott wrote, Dan had some work to do at the church, and she had tagged along and played the piano while she waited for him. Now she anticipated an emotional return. I believe that Dan will be in attendance that day in whatever way that might be possible. I believe that he will be very proud of his sister Stephanie. Mott said the response from the 15 or 16 people who showed up for Sunday school that day was entirely positive, and some of them remembered Dan. One talked with me about how he'd been there for her and her family at a time when they were losing a family member, how much that meant to her, Mott said. I walked out of that place knowing his love for me was enhanced by my authenticity. If Mott is effortlessly certain about the feelings of those now living in the great beyond, there are things about this world she still can't get her head around. When I first started doing this, I would speak to a college class and nobody in the class would know anyone who was transgender, she said. Today, a third or a half of the class knows somebody. It's amazing to me that it's changed that much in that amount of time. It's not that there are more transgender people in the world now, it's that they are more free. After all, as Mott points out, given the vast diversity of creation with so many beautiful variations in all living organisms, it makes no logical sense that humans would have only two narrowly defined genders. Another thing that always amazes Mott is something she feels after her travels around the state. She might have grown up on a farm outside of Lawrence, but it was Topeka where she found salvation. She lives in a small house across the street from the old Monroe Elementary School where she used to vote. In 2008, it was where she first voted as Stephanie. I hadn't legally changed my name yet, but I was presenting as Stephanie. The lady handing out ballots was like, "How can you be Stephen?" I explained that I was transgender. She got a confused look on her face, but this other lady where you pick up your ballot was just smiling. I had to publicly explain what transgender was. Then, in the home of Brown v. Board of Education, she voted for the man who would become the first Black president. These days, the rest of the world might know the capital city of Kansas as the home of the Westboro Baptist Church and a scary legislature, but that's not all it is. Heading back into Topeka on evenings after trips west, as her Hyundai tops the hill just outside of town on Interstate 70, Mott always catches her breath at the sight of the city's lights. Wow, she thinks, this is my home. So that theory, that feeling of home, obviously, it's a big theme throughout the book. I used it in the title of the book. I want to talk just a little bit about what's happened since the book came out. I had to sort of finish up writing in the fall of 2016, and the book came out in 2018. And just as it was coming out, the folks of Manhattan, or just as I was finishing up and getting my pages to the University Press of Kansas, the city of Manhattan finally passed a non-discrimination ordinance. And this is the folks from Manhattan who had worked on that, celebrating that moment at City Hall in Manhattan. In November of 2018, Kansas sends an openly lesbian Native American woman to the United States House of Representatives. I could not have anticipated that when I was writing the book. That same November, Kansas also sends its first openly gay representatives to the Kansas House. This is Susan Ruiz and Brandon Woodard, both from different districts in Johnson County. They get elected in 2018, and they're still serving in the Kansas House. And in the years that followed, as my book comes out, so in my book, I talk about the non-discrimination ordinance efforts in Lawrence. Roland Park passed one of these non-discrimination ordinances in 2014, and then Manhattan, like I just said, in 2016. In the years after that, there's this sort of wave of non-discrimination ordinances that pass in Wyandotte and Johnson counties. This is result of a lot of families getting organized and going back to City Hall and asking for these ordinances and doing a lot of organizing and work. These ordinances, some of them passed easily and quickly without months of debate. A couple of them did get ugly, especially in Olathe. That took a really long time, but just this sort of tactic that wins friends and gets legal protection on the books at City Hall. You could just see this wave of that happening in Kansas in those years. And then in 2020, Kansas elects its first trans legislator. This is Stephanie Byers from Wichita. So really sort of extraordinary progress in those last couple years. But also now what we can see is backlash to that progress. So last year in the state legislature, you can see the sort of news stories that are on the top of the slide. Or there was a bill floated that would have made it a crime for doctors to prescribe health services for trans kids. and the Senate and the House did pass a bill that would prohibit trans girls from participating in sports. It was prevented trans people from participating on sports teams that matched their gender, and that passed. Laura Kelly vetoed it. They were not able to override their veto, but it just got introduced again this session. So we'll see that debate happening again, most likely in the weeks ahead. And oh, look what happened over the summer in July. Wichita finally passes a non-discrimination ordinance. You would think maybe Wichita is one of the state's bigger cities might have done that a little sooner, but it took until July 2021, and it was a close vote, and it was, I think, an unanticipated. The process of that was much more drawn out and contentious than anyone anticipated. There, it's interesting to think about Johnson County, Wyandotte County, other places passing these a couple of years before Wichita. But some of you may anticipate the next slide I'm going to show you. This was not the first time that Wichita had passed a non-discrimination ordinance. Actually, that happened back in 1978. Wichita was one of the early adopters of a non-discrimination ordinance, and it was immediately sort of almost immediately recalled through a petition, citizens petition in Wichita, and it took all these years later to finally get it done. So we're watching history ebb and flow, and I think I'll just sort of get to the end of my slides here by talking about, the subtitle of my book is Lessons in Activism from LGBT Kansas, and there's a lot of different lessons in this book. I interviewed more than 50 people around the state, and I think each person's story has a different lesson, but there were definitely 3 themes that emerged. And so I sort of always like to wrap up with talking about these themes. The 3 lessons really: number 1, prepare to lose. And I think this holds true for any kind of activism. You lose, you lose, you lose. And over the course of those losses, you educate people, you win friends, and finally you win. Number 2, be gentle with your allies. You can see in my book, and really in any political cause, there's a lot of internal debate, a lot of internal fighting about strategy and tactics and language, especially these days when language is changing so much, and it's we don't always know the latest terms, and social media is sort of a minefield. I think it's always important to remember that there's a lot of people who support you, who are on your side, even if they aren't quite up to speed on all the latest terminology. And so you've got to be gentle with those folks as you continue to educate. And then number 3, just do something. There are people in my book who were leading rallies, who were going in front of TV cameras, who was, being quoted in the newspapers and standing up front and testifying at City Hall. And then there were people who were writing anonymous checks, and there were people baking lemon bars. And there's a moment in the book where lemon bars make a difference. So those are the lessons. And I think I will stop sharing now and stop talking for a minute or two. And
well, thank you, CJ, very much. That was a fantastic presentation. And the first question that we have actually came in the midst of something that you were talking about, as far as one theme in your book for sure is this idea of victory within defeat, and that as these defeats pile up, that there are still these victories. And I think you were talking about education when someone asked, how do you measure that success? And so I think, so Susan, if you want to elaborate on your question if I'm getting this wrong. I think the question was getting at as you are educating people and you are accumulating these very successes throughout these difficult defeats. What are some benchmarks or what are some ways upon measuring that?
I will not desperately search through the numbers in my book at this point, but what one really obvious way is election results. I think if you look at again, the stats in the very first couple of slides, you can measure public opinion, and you can so it changed really dramatically over that decade. But you can look at what the margin of loss is over the course of different elections. And, if at first you lose your election by, if you lose your election 70-30, so in 2005, the people who were trying to stop the marriage amendment from passing in that year, their polling showed they would lose by 70%. They knew that 70% of voters would approve the marriage amendment. So they knew what the margin of loss was there. And then, so if you look at a citywide election and, you lose 52-48 one year, but then the next year it's 50-49. That's one way you measure is just election results. Voter registrations, that's the kind of data when you have a citywide referendum, you can actually see who's registered to vote and how they're voting, and you can find where the more friendly neighborhoods are and campaign in those neighborhoods.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense, and I think Susan also clarified here that that we were correct in saying that as you are getting defeated, how do you keep your chin up and see that you are still making progress? So I think when you're talking about some quantitative things like the polling numbers, that's a great example of being able to point to something. And then I guess generally speaking though too, as far as just that idea of keeping your chin up, I mean, you talked about be prepared for defeat, but what are some also kind of general strategies as far as keeping positive in such a difficult fight?
That's a really good question, and I don't think there's probably as many different answers to that as there are people who are involved in the cause. Usually, it's a very small number of people who are involved in the cause, and they're folks who can afford to, for whatever reason, they know they won't lose their jobs, or they know they're already out to their family members, and so they know that their risk is minimal, and so they already have most likely a support system in place, and they may be sort of skilled, long-term sort of political junkie type people who are just ready for it and want to fight. There are other people who are brought to it because they just feel it. They feel the significance of the cause. Something changes in them, something, they have some kind of experience at work that makes them realize how important this is, or some kind of switch flips and they pick up their sign and they go out and stand on the street corner. It just sort of is different for everybody, but a theme that emerged in the folks who I talked to, that a lot of these folks were like, I live here, this is my home, this is my community, I'm under threat and I need to respond, or I see an opportunity to make things better here, not just for me, but for the people who are younger than I am, for the kids, for the next generation, the people who are coming up in the world. And that's a pretty strong motivator, especially, when you get to a certain age and you kind of have the experience to withstand the difficulties that come along with those kind of battles. Some people are just wired for it. Some people are not wired for it, but find the strength somehow.
Right.
A lot of that happens through community, because communities do coalesce around these efforts.
Well, that might be a perfect transition into our next question, which speaking of communities, and you alluded to that oftentimes, and I would imagine, especially in Kansas, these are small groups of people that are banding together. And so I know this is kind of broad, but broadly speaking, what are some of the maybe key similarities or differences between the story in Kansas and some of the larger coastal cities that we often tend to hear more about when we are talking about LGBTQ history?
That's a really big story, and there are many books written about it, and movies, documentaries, and fictional movies like Milk that tell this story. I mean, I think that these days we consider the Stonewall Rebellion in New York City in 1969 as the beginning of the modern LGBT rights movement, but there were certainly sort of underground communities. As long as there have been people, there have been LGBTQ people, and so they found each other one way or another. And since Stonewall, they've become more gradually more open. And the 1978 was sort of like a big year for this, and a lot of it was gay people were coming out around the country in those years, and that brought a backlash from Anita Bryant, who made a very public national campaign called Save Our Children, and there was a lot of distress that in California that year. There was a big citizens initiative that would have banned gay people from teaching in public schools. And so there's a big political effort to organize that. But this gets beyond the scope of my expertise, Austin. But in the big cities, traditionally gay people from small rural places moved to big cities and found communities. And that's why you have the San Francisco and the New York, LA, Atlanta. But it's just now beginning to emerge that a lot of gay people stayed right where they were and found support in their own towns, and farms and hamlets throughout the entire country.
Yes, and in your book, I mean, you do allude to something here at the Kansas Historical Society. We have an original flag by Gilbert Baker, who was a Kansan who felt the need to move away from Kansas, but is the creator of the rainbow flag that is so synonymous with the LGBTQ stories that we are associating with today. So I would hope that yes, we are seeing individuals who maybe used to feel the need to move away, not so much the case today. The next person here has said, thanks for your presentation, CJ. As you know, I loved your book. Is there another in process?
No. There is, I thought I had one in process, but I've sort of realized that that may be a series of separate essays. So I don't know, it's just so funny. I've been asked that question so many times in book talks, when's the next one? And I don't know, one might be enough.
Well, I'm sure you can't, force such things, and maybe you're even working on it without knowing that you're
right.
working on it. But I would actually follow up. I meant to ask you this before we went live, but I remembered pre-COVID some talk about a documentary film version of the book. And is that, where might that be at this point?
That is the really the one of the amazing surprises to come out of this project. So the amazing Oscar-winning Kansas filmmaker Kevin Wilmot, through mutual friends, Kevin became interested in the book, and we began talking about him making a documentary version of it. And so that project started several years ago, and we began interviewing a few of the people who are in the book. But then, similarly, like when I was trying to write the book, things were changing so quickly that I could barely keep up. And what's happened is the movie has sort of turned into a little bit of a sequel to the book. So we've shot several of the events, including some of the folks that in the slides that I showed at the very end. We've interviewed a bunch of people about things that have happened since the book came out, and we are very close to being done. I say with fingers crossed, because I've learned that making a movie might actually take longer than writing a book, and is a lot more involved, but it's been such an honor to work with Kevin Wilmot. We hope that this will be ready for airing on public television stations in June. That's our hope right now.
Okay, well, we'll definitely be looking forward to that. So I hope that we can see that soon as well. The next question, I admit, is probably going to be tough for you to answer fully. They have any predictions on what will happen in the next few years regarding what we're seeing put forth by the legislature right now? And I'm going to assume they're referring to the transgender bills that you've referenced, and so any predictions regarding what the next few years might hold, I guess.
I think we're just going to see more of the same. The folks who, this is a very, very rough time for America, for American democracy, for not only for marginalized groups, but certainly for marginalized groups. I think we're just seeing a very intense backlash to a lot of progress in recent years.
Yeah, I certainly understand what you're saying there. And the next question here is more just about your research and where it is that that you traveled around the state, but were there any archives that you visited in particular to write this book?
I did not visit archives so much, and I have to say that's because I was interviewing people who I was doing a lot of live interviews. So this is a book of journalism and sort of in the moment history. I was able to get most of the story that I was trying to tell, mostly through those interviews, but online newspaper articles were the main archival resources that I used. There are and oral histories at the KU libraries. There's an oral history project there, and so I consulted those quite a bit.
Would that be the Under the Rainbow?
The Under the Rainbow project there, and a librarian named Tammy Albin worked on that. It really collected some amazing stories, including one from Gilbert Baker, the designer of the rainbow flag, and that's archived at KU libraries.
Yes. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that I think one of those pictures that you showed of Stephanie Mott, that you yourself had donated some materials to our archives, that people could check out some of the work that Stephanie did.
I have some original pictures of Stephanie, and Stephanie posted. She posted a lot on Facebook, and she had a website. The Kansas statewide Transgender Education Project website had links to so many presentations, and when she died, that sort of eventually that website went away, and so there's just an enormous loss there. And I always, I think her car should be in a museum, and I don't know where her car is now. But I think that just, being able to have access to those materials and those images, I really learned how important it is to have those materials available for people to find when they need them, including another example is the Liberty Press which was I think it was a monthly newspaper published out of Wichita and distributed throughout the state. And that was really a lifeline for people all throughout Kansas in super rural areas. They could subscribe to that. And Stephanie wrote a column for that. And the publisher, Christy Parker, died unexpectedly. And there were not, I don't know what plans there were to make sure that those copies of that publication, full volumes, full sets, I don't know where those are now either.
Well, we certainly appreciate you donating Stephanie's materials to our archives so that people can see not just the photographs, but also many of the presentations that she gave, and just in general, and all the work that you've done as far as confirming and helping us to tell Kansas history, and the fact that LGBTQ history is Kansas history and Kansas history is LGBTQ history. So with that, I just have to say thank you so much, CJ.
Can I say one thing about that though, Austin?
Absolutely, yes.
There are so many more books to be written about LGBT history in Kansas, and to Ted, whoever is asking me if there's another book, please ask all your other friends if they will write a book, because there are, I can think of 4 or 5 that need to be written as we speak. So please, historians, students, those books need to be written. Sorry.
No, I couldn't agree more. So that was worth jumping in, because yes, we are all about documenting history, and these are stories that need to be told. So in the spirit of that, thank you, CJ, so much for telling your story this evening, and for joining us in tonight's program. And thank you to everyone else who joined us this evening. I hope you'll be able to join us again next month on Friday, March 11th at 6:30 to hear Dr. John Curatola present Autumn of Our Discontent, the 1949 Crisis in American National Security. The fall of 1949 led to a change in the American military tradition. The notion that the United States would return to a small peacetime military posture following World War II was shattered with the Soviets' first successful atomic weapon test in August and the establishment of the Communist People's Republic of China on October 1st. Throughout the events of a single calendar season, the United States found itself facing a crisis that would soon become the Cold War. So again, we hope that you can join us for next month's presentation. And for all of us here at Museum After Hours, thank you so much for tuning in, and have a great